Hello, everyone, and welcome to NCSL's webinar, What to Consider When You're Expecting More Absentee Voting. My name is Wendy Underhill, and I will be moderating the webinar today. I'm the Director of Elections and Redistricting here at the National Conference of State Legislatures. Behind the scenes today, I'm supported by Brian Hinkle and the rest of our team. Please know that our number one responsibility is to provide legislators and legislative staff with information and analysis on anything related to elections, campaign finance, and redistricting. So ask us anything at elections-info@ncsl.org or wendy.underhill@ncsl.org or brian.hinkle@ncsl.org. The plan for today has three parts. First, Amber McReynolds, the director of the National Vote at Home Institute, will provide an outline of what states can be working on now in anticipation of much higher numbers of absentee ballots than perhaps we've ever seen before. And second, we'll hear from Mark Braden, a partner at Baker Hostetler and a preeminent attorney focusing on political processes, including elections and redistricting. More importantly, to me at least, Mark has been a longtime friend to NCSL. And last, we'll turn to Chairman Ben Hovland of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. He and the rest of the EAC team have been blazing fast at producing guidelines and advice relating to this year's changes in election policy, primarily changes that involve more absentee voting. Now for a few practicalities for the next 60 minutes. Above the presentation itself, you will see a couple of tabs with one of them labeled Resources. Here you can find and download a PDF version of the PowerPoint, as well as additional handouts. And you will want these slides, I'm pretty sure, so go ahead and do that. Another tab is labeled Speaker, where you'll find the bios for today's speakers, and we'll put up their email addresses at the end. And you can access these tabs at any time during the presentation. To make this a teeny bit interactive, please take a look at the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. That's where you can type in who you are and where you're from. I don't see much in there yet. I see my colleague Mandy Zock is there. But anyone, please tell us what state you're from and perhaps your institution. That would be great. I'm waiting to see some names pop up. This webinar platform is optimized for use in Google Chrome. While other web browsers such as Firefox may work, we recommend anyone who's experiencing technical difficulties try signing in through Chrome instead. If you continue to experience technical issues, please email registration@ncsl.org or my colleague Brian Hinkle, whose email address is on the slide. Oh, good. Now I'm seeing everyone up there. Many people from legislatures. That's exactly what we want to see. And someone from ARP. That's great, too. Okay, so we're going to answer the questions at the end of the presentations, and we hope you'll stay on the line afterward for a quick survey on what other topics you might like us to address in future webinars. In fact, you can also pop those ideas into the chat box of things that come to your mind that we might want to address at some other point. That would be great, too. And lastly, today's webinar is being recorded. The link to access the recording will be added to the webinar registration page within a day or two, so you or your colleagues or anyone can take another look at it if you'd like to. And that is it for me. Amber, are you ready to go?
Yes.
Okay, all yours.
Okay. Well, hi, everyone. And first I want to thank NCSL and Wendy and Brian and the team at NCSL for inviting me to be a part of this webinar today and for all of the work that NCSL does across the country to help legislators and policymakers with research and information and best practice and whatnot. NCSL is, I think, one of the core organizations and leaders on making sure that legislators have access to information that they need as they make policy decisions. So grateful to be here, and I will start off with giving kind of a landscape of how we're seeing trends across the country right now. As I've titled this presentation, Delivering and Strengthening Democracy is really the core mission of the National Vote at Home Institute. As our name suggests, we do focus specifically on how to improve vote by mail, absentee voting, and vote at home policies. A lot of times those terms are all used interchangeably, but we focus on how do we make the system around voting by mail safe, secure, more accessible, and equitable across all the options. And we never say that we want universal vote by mail or all mail. Those are not terms that our organization uses. In fact, we advocate for systems that are modeled off of what various Western states have adopted, including Colorado, Utah, Oregon, Washington, now Hawaii, and California as well. And what that means is that's about sending the ballot, but also preserving in-person voting options should voters choose to do that. So first and foremost, the challenge this year is that the pandemic has sort of upended what the traditional way that most voters vote is in the country, and that has been historically in-person voting. Usually about 70% or so of voters, and a lot of headlines are going to come up on screen right now sort of showing the way that most people have voted in recent memory, with frankly a lot of bad headlines on there as well, which has been predominantly in-person voting. And I've got another slide that'll show the trends change over the last 25 years or so. But it's important for us, I think, to recognize why the in-person voting structure is at risk. And you saw a lot of pictures with large crowds and long lines and all of that. And that is particularly problematic and makes the system very vulnerable when we're dealing with a pandemic. And so what's happening right now is we're really seeing a significant shift to voters, for voters actually choosing to request a ballot be mailed to them, vote by mail. In some cases, states are encouraging that, but we're seeing this huge shift. And the trend suggests that increase is going to be exponential for the next 5 to 6 months as we lead up to the election. And so what we need to do is be very thoughtful about how we help election officials plan for that, how we potentially adjust our policies to deal with that increase, and how we make sure that the systems that are in place are ready to handle that volume. So the time to act is now. Again, we need to ensure every single voter can vote in a safe, secure, accessible, and equitable way. And we also need to be decisive and immediate. So there's already state legislative bodies around the country that are taking action to make modifications and give and make sure there's solutions in place so that voters can vote. And obviously that requires political leadership and will to take action now to make sure that voters have access. A couple of ways that we're unique, just for our organization, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit, and our goal is to support states with implementation, train election officials, and advise on best practices, provide guidance to policymakers on how best to structure laws and regulations on this topic, and then even advise governors and top officials on high-level strategies and plans. And we've had to do that a little bit recently just with some of the emergency orders and changes that some states had to make sure they could conduct their primaries, including, for instance, Maryland and other states that have made those decisions recently. This is the current map of the country, and last Friday, California announced that they are going to move ahead with sending a ballot to every elector in advance of November's election to cut down on the number of people that vote in person. They were a state that had a little more than 70% of voters already asking to get their ballot mailed to them at home or voting by mail already, but they are the sixth state to become that. The first was Oregon, the second was Washington, and then Colorado, Utah, Hawaii, and then now California. The other thing to point out on this map is the step 4, which is sort of the lighter blue color, it just means that the state has what's called a single sign-up, no excuse option. So in Montana, Arizona, Nevada, Virginia now, as of this summer, and New Jersey, all allow you as a voter to sign up not only for the upcoming election, but if you want to get your ballot mailed to you in all subsequent elections after that, you can do that unless you move. And then the majority of the country falls into a no excuse required status. So that just means that voters can request a ballot each election, but they have to make that request each cycle or each election, which means all those election officials have to process that data entry every single cycle. So right now, if we even just look back at Wisconsin, they went from 120,000 absentee requests 3 weeks prior to their primary to 1.4 million by the day of the primary. And so the election officials experienced a huge volume increase, and they had to process all of that paperwork ahead of the election, which created a significant administrative burden and added a ton of cost to how they were running the election. We're seeing that same thing play out in Georgia right now, and also even in Nebraska yesterday, where they had record turnout, but they also had record vote by mail, and they had to process all of those applications and those requests that were coming in. That's where the majority of states land. And then there's the states that still require an excuse. So in the step one states, an excuse is required for every single voter. So Missouri and Arkansas and West Virginia, those states all still require very strict excuses, meaning that you have to prove that you're going to be out of the jurisdiction, or that you have a health consideration, or maybe you qualify for religious considerations, which is one of the excuses in Missouri. And then in Texas, in Louisiana, a few of the other states, they have a excuse required, but they have an age waiver. So if you're over 65 and over, say in the state of Texas, you can request a ballot without providing an excuse. But if you're 64 and a half, you're going to have an excuse. So there's some disparities in terms of in terms of the age of voters, which we tend to think is sort of, it creates administrative burdens, but it also creates some confusion, frankly, amongst voters. The next slide shows the trends I mentioned. So since 1992, on this slide, the green line is mail and absentee voting. The orange is early and in-person, and the blue is election day only voting. And you can see that blue line has been steadily decreasing since 1992, and it's approaching, it was sort of, as of 2018, approaching to be about 50% of the electorate choosing to vote in person on election day. We think that trend is going to go down even more significantly this year, and we're already seeing that with the primaries. And so the green line is the mail ballot one. That's going up in a tremendous way, and early voting kind of goes up and down depending on the election cycle, which usually relates to a presidential. This is the current primary turnout. So as of yesterday, this is the lay of the land in terms of all the states that have conducted primaries recently. And all of the green bars, either the light green, which means that more than 2/3 of the electorate requested a ballot by mail, or in the darker green, which is a state that sent out a ballot to everyone, this is how turnout lands. And so you can see on here, Colorado and Washington, which had March primaries, are at the top of the list, followed by Wisconsin, which had the majority of votes cast by mail, and California as a fourth. And by the way, California has never been in the top 5 states for this sort of metric. And then it sort of goes down from there. Ohio is interesting. They just had their primary, their rescheduled primary. They did a couple of things that were very unique. They did not mail an absentee application to everyone, but at the same time told their electorate that the election was going to be conducted primarily by mail, but they didn't give everyone an application. So we sort of think that their turnout lagged a little bit comparatively because they didn't offer a way for voters to sign up in a convenient way, and they did have some issues around that. Versus other states like Nebraska and also Georgia have taken the action of sending out an application, which makes it a little bit easier for voters to understand what they're supposed to do. The other metric I wanted to share, this gets asked a lot, is how does vote by mail impact the voters with disabilities? And what's interesting is when we plot out the states here, the red dots are the states that require excuses. So that's the Texas of the world, Louisiana, those sorts of things. And then the purple dots are no excuse absentee states. And then the green are the single sign-up, or the blue is the single sign-up states, which kind of go farther down towards the right. And then the vote by mail states, and on this chart, because it was 2018, was Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, are the green. And what this chart is showing is that the gap in turnout, so showing that we've essentially closed the gap, the more accessible you make vote by mail in a state. And the reason for that is voters with disabilities, often their greatest challenge in dealing with getting to the voting location is transportation to get there. So the problem is that for a long time, we've invested heavily in outfitting polling places and making them more accessible and having a lot of machines available, which is great to an extent. But if the voter can't get there from a transportation perspective, all of that doesn't really mean anything. So I think the other thing on here is that from an accessibility perspective, this type of model also increases options for voters that have those challenging transportation issues. The next thing, the final thing, and I've got just 2 slides left here. To deal with the increase in volume that we're seeing, and I think it's highly possible based on the trends that instead of there being 30% of the country, which is sort of the historical figure from 2018, 30% voting by mail, I think it's possible that we're going to see a reversal where it's going to be more between 50 to 70% of the country will vote by mail. I think at least 50. I think it could go as high as 70, maybe even higher than that. And so given that, we have to make sure states are prepared for that volume. And as we've seen in a few primaries recently, some of the policies and procedures that are currently on the books and the laws in various states create administrative burdens that make it way more expensive, cost inefficient, and challenging for election administrators to administer. So we've made a lot of suggestions on our website. We've drafted a vote at home and vote by mail scale plan that makes various recommendations on equipment and how to think about this in a different way. And then today we're rolling out a 50-state matrix that really dives into the very specific details across many metrics on what states can do to improve this process and how they can act now ahead of the election to make sure that we address some of the issues that we're seeing across the board. And finally, and I know this is going to be shared, we've got some links to various resources that we have here on our website. I've also included a couple of our partner resources, including a timeline produced by CISA and a Center for Civic Design Toolkit. We've also drafted a myth document about voting fraud and how to protect systems and protect voters from nefarious and bad actors. And then our 50-state policy plan will be released today, so we'll have another update on that on our website. So with that, I'll stop there, and I appreciate being here.
Thank you very much, Amber. That was excellent and a good way to kick us off. I do have a question about California for you. Is that decision permanent for all the years to come, or is that specific to the November election that California will host its elections by mail and not by the previous system where counties could decide?
Well, it's been announced for this year. I think the challenge is that their legislation around the Voter Choice Act basically enacted that type of opt-in system by 2022 and 2024. There were sort of 2 provisions in there. So now that they've kind of jumped to this year, there's sort of discussion of, well, how could they really kind of go back the other direction, if you will. So my guess is they're going to have a policy discussion about what this looks like post-2020.
Okay, that's great. And I see that we have some folks on from Hawaii, which is the other state that recently shifted in this direction. And I think this is their first year to try it. Okay, we're going to turn over to Mark Braden now. And during Mark's talk, listen carefully because it's the words, not the slides. You're going to get to just look at his face while he talks. I hope that made sense. There's no technical problem. There's no slides at this point. Mark, go ahead.
Sure, I'm the guy with the gray beard and gray hair. So, well, let me say something right up front, which some people will find surprising, but let me just I do not accept the notion that the either increasing turnout or increasing mail voting you can identify on a nationwide basis or probably on a statewide basis the partisan effect of it. We are in changing coalitions and changing circumstances. So there's some conventional wisdom out there on this subject. It may be conventional. I don't believe it's wisdom, and I think that carefully looking at the issue shows the difficulty in determining whether or not one system benefits Republicans or Democrats. So I'll just say that right up front, that I just don't believe that, and I think the data probably is too cloudy to make any determination on that. And also one other caveat, which is probably more believable to the audience, which is I don't know what the November landscape is going to look like in the sense of the pandemic and whether we will be in a position for people to be able to vote in person. Just like I don't know whether when the NFL plays a football game in November, whether they're going to actually play a football game, whether they're going to play a football game in an empty stadium or a half-full stadium. I don't know any of that. So as I sit here today and speak to you, I know too little about the pandemic and the ability to predict going forward. I just simply don't know, and I don't think anyone does. I think that realistically, you need to prepare for a situation where it may be difficult and unsafe for a significant portion of the electorate to vote in person. So you have to prepare for that. Whether that will be what will happen or not, I don't know. But let me talk a little bit regarding the issues with mail voting and using. It's a slightly different term than absentee. Sometimes they get used interchangeably. Absentee voting can certainly include other things, voting absentee other than at a polling place that doesn't involve the mail. It could be early voting. But today we talk about in the concept of mail voting. These are three things I think you need to think about in this this process. And really, it's the misadventures, mail voting. It's the malfeasance with mail voting. And then the civic role of Election Day. So let me talk a little bit about misadventures. Over the years, I've run a statewide election system, or been a lawyer for a statewide election system, and I've done dozens of recounts for the House of Representatives and various statewide recounts. And recounts, what the election officials on here know, is sort of the careful examination of the election system. And a lot of election officials talk about betting their jobs on recounts because the recounts turn up the shortcomings. And the shortcomings of various systems across the country in recount situations, the vast majority of the time, involve mail voting. So, and the problems that turn up and the questions and the arguments and the litigation generally revolves around the question of mail absentee ballots. So let's talk about the misadventures. The misadventures start with the mail and the limitations of mail and the different levels of the quality of mail service in different neighborhoods of the country. Higher socioeconomic neighborhoods get better mail service. Rural areas often have problems with mail service and timing. It's a government form. Guess what? Government forms tend to be difficult for many people to fill out correctly. My experience with the electorate is if you give them a piece of paper and a writing utensil, you'll be surprised about the originality of what comes back. So there are problems. There are time problems here. Mail doesn't arrive necessarily timely, and it doesn't necessarily arrive at the right place. And mail tends to be one of those things that has a huge bounce as to again, what neighborhood it is in, what particular post office is doing it. And so there are lots of problems with the timing issue. So those are sort of what I would call the misadventures of mail. It's just all the ones that you would expect and all the problems one has with lots and lots of pieces of paper that are executed by individuals who do it once every 2 years, once every 4 years type situation. So that's the big factor. In every recount I've been involved with, there have been problems on these issues by ballots cast. Now, the other problem is malfeasance. We have a very good, efficient polling place system in our country. And the reason that involves a secret ballot and careful supervision of election officials, generally from both parties. That system was adopted effectively in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the so-called Australian ballot system, because of very significant nationwide ballot fraud. So we have a system that works very well at the polling place in the sense that people have a security as to the casting of the ballot, the ability to cast a ballot in secret. The reality is we do away, by doing mail voting, we significantly do away with the protections that were enacted in the progressive movement in the 1890s and then 1910, 1915. So there's no longer a guarantee that the ballots are cast in secret. So there's no guarantee that you can keep people from being intimidated and or votes being purchased. So there are, unfortunately, today, you don't have to you don't need to go back to deep, dark history. Today, there's an article out of Paterson, New Jersey, where they have doubts about the absentee ballots, the mail ballots they've received so far. The number they're talking about right now is 6% of them being suspicious. So the malfeasance is real. Election fraud, intimidation, and buying votes at the polling place is almost unknown. Very, very rare, and frankly, in the polling place involves a conspiracy of poll workers, so it almost never happens. Our polling place system works extremely well. Unfortunately, there are numerous examples of mail voting not working well because of fraud. People steal money, people steal cars. How would we be surprised that people steal votes? They simply do it. That said, and some of them affect the races. I mean, we've had a couple mayor's races in the last few years that have been thrown out because of absentee voting fraud. Frankly, as shows up on my resume here, years ago I used to be the chief counsel for the Republican National Committee. I left the Ohio Secretary of State office to take that job. The very first thing I did for the Republican National Committee back in the late 70s was to go to Philadelphia for a special election. And there was a special election because there had been a recount, and the state senator, during the recount, they had found out the incumbent state senator, his garage had cast 18 or 19 absentee ballots. Obviously, his garage actually didn't cast those ballots. So there are problems with fraud. And then I will also say that, and I'm old school on this, that there is a huge value to the shared civic event of voting in person, and the importance of an election process that goes to Election Day and pretty much ends on Election Day. And mail voting presents problems there, and they are significant, and it does away with that. Is mail voting more convenient? Yeah, absolutely. But there are these downsides to it. So, all that said, I don't know what's going to be happening in November, and certainly I believe the states need to prepare for the potential of everybody voting by mail or a significant subset of them. And you need to be cognizant of the reality of fraud here and attempt to deal with it. And some of the safeguards. Let's be honest, though, some of the safeguards are going to not work because it's unrealistic. We have signature processes, and I'm wildly in favor of continuing signature processes, and I'm wildly in favor of people looking at the signatures and comparing them. But let's be candid. In most jurisdictions across the country, there's a wildly different treatment of signature verification from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and plenty of examples of that in recounts of different jurisdictions handling it in different ways, the classic Bush v. Gore unequal treatment problem. So that absolutely exists. The notion that any individual sort of layperson can verify a signature, I will have to tell you no is the answer to that. I was watching Antique Roadshow. I have more time to watch TV than I used to. I'm watching Antique Roadshow. I'm looking somebody with the Louisiana Hayride, famous touring group of rock stars back in the 1950s. and a woman comes up with and it has the signature of Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash on it. And she got that when she was a young teenager at an event they did in the 50s. And it was interesting listening to this person who's in the business of authenticating signatures and the sale of this type of paraphernalia. And her response was, of course, I believe these are authentic signatures because you're standing here and you're telling me you were at that event. But I'm telling you that if you were not present to give this to me and explain to me how you got it, I would reject these as forgeries because they don't look like the signatures of these two individuals 5 or 10 years later. The signatures are important. There's various, hopefully sometime in the future we could go to some other technologies, maybe thumbprints or whatever, that would solve some of these problems. But the safeguards, if you're going to do and go to mail voting, you need to be thinking about how to safeguard the system. It's not only a question of fraud, it's the perceptions of fraud are extremely important too. So there are real fraud. This is not sort of paranoid Republican talk. There's real fraud. Everybody involved in the process on a regular basis doing election contests or running elections knows that absentee ballot through the mail is a problem. It may be we have no choice. And I absolutely believe that if you can't vote safely in person, then we need to come up with a different system. But you need to be very thoughtful about it. And I have to say that California deciding to mail ballots out to every name that appears on a registration list, because that's not every voter. There'll be lots and lots and lots of people on those lists, thousands, probably tens of thousands of ballots going out to people, to addresses and to people who aren't eligible voters now because they've moved or died or don't exist. So that needs to be done thoughtfully, and this is certainly doing a contingent and trying to think about how to do it thoughtfully is certainly should be done right now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. I appreciate your comments today. You started off with the Postal Service, and I think we all know that there are questions about its viability. Literally, as we were on the phone, one of my daughters texted me, and that she wrote to her congressperson saying, we got to protect the Postal Service. Now, I was very surprised that my daughter cared about that, but that's what she sent to me today. I think for the time being, that's a question that I think Commissioner Hovland is going to address for us. Let's see. And you also talked about security, and you talked about the signature verification, which I know that different states, exactly as you said, do it in very different ways. It's not always the same. I'm familiar with the way they do it in Denver, where there's first a digital scan, and bipartisan teams look at those signatures compared to signatures that are on record. And if the team doesn't agree that it's a good signature, it's a bad signature, it gets booted upstairs. So Denver's one place where they've got a pretty good system kind of locked down. And then I'll also just mention that on the security side, and again here too, Commissioner, you might jump in on here, the ability for a voter to cure a problem might be something that could be considered that way. Having provisional ballots is another possibility if people have a problem with getting their vote counted. And on the front end is the voter registration. So I think we can say that the cleaner your rolls are, at least it certainly makes for a cleaner election as well. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Chairman.
Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate the opportunity to join this webinar and for all the great work that you and the NCSL team do. As we make sure I've got control here. Yes, success. All right. Again, thank you for having me. It's great to join this audience. But as everyone here knows, the novel coronavirus or COVID-19 is presenting unprecedented challenges around our country, and of course the election administration community is facing real challenges determining how to best conduct elections in this environment. At the EAC, we've pivoted substantially to focus our attention on how we can support state and local election officials as they make tough decisions about their primaries and the general election. We've done this in a number of ways. We held a virtual public hearing on April 22nd to discuss the issues presented by running elections during this pandemic. That is available on our website if anyone, eac.gov, if anyone wants to watch that. But we also were exploring how to make voting as safe as possible for all Americans. At that hearing, we discussed the challenges of conducting elections during this pandemic with state and local election officials, an accessibility expert, and a representative from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC. The EAC has also hosted a number of Zoom videos or web chats where we bring together experts from the elections field to discuss best practices and lessons learned on particular topics. This slide has a screenshot of the first video in this series. The 3 election officials we heard from had all transitioned from a traditional polling place model election to a mail-driven election during their careers. And they discussed the challenges and lessons learned from ramping up vote by mail and provided very practical examples of the success stories as well as pitfalls and how to avoid them. The states or jurisdictions that had previously moved to full vote by mail had the luxury of time to make this transition. For current election administrators, time is not a luxury they have, so learning from their colleagues will be crucial to successfully implementing procedures to handle the anticipated surge in mail and absentee ballot demand this year. Many of the things that Amber flagged earlier, certainly crucial to that success. And another way that we've been sharing these best practices is through the critical infrastructure subsector. The EAC is leading a joint working group between the Government Coordinating Council and the Sector Coordinating Council. Essentially what that means is that we have state and local election officials along with private industry experts working with staff from the EAC and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, on a number of documents that address considerations and best practices for voting during the pandemic. These documents are on the EAC website, again, eac.gov, and range the entire process of planning for increased absentee or mail ballots. There are additional documents coming out shortly that you can see there on steps to make polling places as safe as possible for election workers and voters. We appreciate all of our local, state, and federal partners who have helped these efforts. I'm hopeful that these resources I mentioned can help the unique challenges election officials face, but ultimately with the 50 states running elections 50 different ways, each state is in a different place in determining the best way for their state to proceed. We certainly have seen that in the grant request letters we've been receiving from the states as we distribute the $400 million in CARES Act funding that Congress provided for elections. The CARES Act was signed into law on March 27th. I'm pleased to report that the EAC awarded all 56 CARES Act grants on April 6th. Currently, 54 states and territories have requested disbursement of the funds and submitted descriptions of their anticipated activities. The two remaining states have been in communication with the EAC and will submit their request letters after approval from their state legislature. In a few cases, the state requires a legislative vote on the required 20% match or other authorization before they can submit their request. In almost all of these remaining cases, states expect their internal processes to be completed by June. Regardless of the actual disbursement date of the funds, it is important to know that states have the authority to obligate funds under the grants as of March 28, 2020. To assist states in requesting the grant money and meeting the 20% match requirement, the EAC has hosted 4 webinars. We've also produced an FAQ document and are providing other guidance around permissible uses for the money. Really, the simplest way to boil down how you can figure out if the expenses are allowed is simply saying, are these additional costs to conduct the election that are part of a response to the COVID-19 pandemic? And so in our communications with the states regarding the CARES Act funding, what we've heard is that election officials are anticipating a wide array of costs associated with responding to this pandemic. For example, costs associated with increasing telework for staff such as laptops and mobile IT equipment. Most commonly, we are hearing about increased costs associated with absentee or mail ballots. costs like increased printing and postage, additional processing equipment, high-speed scanners, and drop boxes. But these costs also include systematic upgrades to allow for online absentee ballot requests or to expand state portals to ensure voters with disabilities have access to tools that can enable expanded use of absentee or mail ballots. Also, the increased need around personal protective equipment or PPE, deep cleaning of polling places, sanitizing supplies, and expanded curbside access. Clearly, there's no shortage of needs or work to be done. But between the CARES Act and the earlier Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2020, the EAC is distributing $825 million to states this year to assist with federal elections. We know this funding will be crucial because of the additional expenses related to running elections during the pandemic. As I mentioned earlier, because each state runs elections differently, each response to this pandemic has been somewhat different. The documents that we've created with the COVID-19 working group I mentioned recognize this. They also recognize that certain decisions will have consequences and require appropriate planning. For example, if a jurisdiction is able to acquire an automated envelope sorting equipment, while this will be a significant capital investment, it also will reduce staffing needs and some space considerations for ballot processing. On the other hand, if a jurisdiction does not believe that sorting equipment is needed or it can't afford such equipment, then plans must be made for additional staffing in a way that allows for social distancing. Essentially, each state's response is ultimately a decision tree, and this is a critical piece of information for state legislatures considering reforms. As Amber mentioned, there is a need to be decisive and immediate. Certainly, some of these decisions will be made for states if they're not able to make the decisions immediately, because there are, as everyone on this call knows, procedures with state and local procurement requirements, et cetera. Certainly, supply chain concerns are real in this area as well. And so, certainly as we think through these reforms, another example that I would give, might be a state considering a change in the acceptance of mail or absentee ballots from a received by election day standard, meaning that you're only going to count a ballot that's received by the election official on election day or before, to a postmark standard, which means a ballot postmarked on or before election day may be accepted and counted for some period of time following the election. This sounds like a very simple change, but it could have a real impact on election administrators if certain deadlines are not changed accordingly, like certification of the election. So I'd strongly encourage anyone watching this or thinking about reforms to work with their state and local election officials to identify any subsequent issues that will need to be addressed. And as an additional great resource, again, NCSL has done a fantastic job tracking many of the variations in election administration across the country and has examples of what other states are doing. Also along those lines, the EAC is committed to doing whatever we can to help address this challenge. And please do not hesitate to reach out if there's anything the EAC or our federal partners can do to provide additional assistance. Thank you.
Well, and thank you, Chairman. I appreciate your comments here and your nice nod to NCSL's resources. The way I think of it is that we're looking at the policy choices that legislators might be looking at, and you're primarily supporting the work of the election officials. But if we could just have one wish granted, it would be that legislators and election officials work closely together. So that was probably where we get the best steps forward. Now, your last slide, the one that's still up, is about the CARES funds. And could you take a moment and just comment on the 20% match? You know that state budgets are really hard hit. Do you have any sense of whether states are going to be able to access that money given that there's a match there?
Absolutely. So certainly this is a concern area we've heard, and that's certainly why we've been doing a lot of work around this with the webinars. One of the things, recent HAVA funds, I'll start back with 2018. Obviously, there was, the original tranche of HAVA had over $3 billion, but starting in 2018, there was $380 million of election security grants that came down with FY18, and those had a 5% match. I think what our experience with that was, frankly, 5% wasn't that significant of a lift, and most states just appropriated that themselves. With the 2020 Consolidated Appropriations Act, there was a 20% match requirement for that $425 million. And then because the 2020 CARES Act money was a supplemental, while it didn't explicitly say there was a 20% match, because it was a supplemental, it took that 20% match that was within the 2020 Consolidated Appropriations Act, and it continued that requirement. And so what a lot of our webinars have been doing, and a lot of our grants team working with states, has been to help them identify other areas that can be used for the match. So as you know, these all go to the chief state election official to disperse that money. But there's a lot of ways, whether the state provides the matching in an appropriation or utilizes, for example, local spending, there are different ways to meet that match. And we've been doing some work to help people identify the ways that may work for their state. And so the local match example is probably the best way to identify how to get there. So this is for any cost that you have above and beyond your traditional expenses that are related to the COVID response. So, for example, if a state had traditionally had, let's say, 10% absentees, and now all of a sudden they're looking at 50% absentee ballots or mail ballots, well, that 40% difference, those are all eligible costs, because those are new costs associated with the COVID pandemic. And so the math is not quite this, but it's pretty close. I'll do it for essentially for every 5 federal dollars, you have to have 1 state or local dollar spent. So it's not quite a clean 80-20, but I wasn't a math major, so I'll just stick with 80-20. So essentially, if a state chief election official were to say to the county, we will reimburse you up to 80% on your spending in this area, and then a jurisdiction provides, okay, I spent, $1 million, then the state could reimburse $800,000 and use that other spending that was in this response to COVID toward the match. And so, again, it has taken a little bit of creativity, but there are other ways than just a straight existing appropriation to make that match requirement, number one. And then number two, I think it's very clear that state and local governments are going to have these expenses regardless. And so we really are trying to encourage people to utilize this money and help them to do that.
Well, that's great. I like the fact that you're looking for creativity and even flexibility on that match. I appreciate that. We will take questions in just a minute, but I do want everyone to know that today's webinar is the second in a 4-part series. The first one was last week, and it featured Tammy Patrick and Nebraska Senator Andrew LaGrone. That's available as an archive. And next week, I was going to say we were going to dive into all mail elections, but I just got schooled earlier by Amber that that's really an inaccurate way to say it. So next week, we'll dive into elections in the 6 states that are going to send a ballot to registered voters. And then the last session will be more interactive. We'll have Amber back on it. It's going to be by Zoom, so that's a great time to bring your questions forward. And in the meantime, do check out NCSL's Voting Outside the Polling Place resource. That has tables at the bottom that address many of the things that we've been discussing today. And we've heard that National Vote at Home Institute's website has a great resource box as well. I'm not sure if we've got it up here on the slide. I don't think so, but that's worth checking out too. Okay, back to our presenters. I'd like to ask each of you to either respond to someone else's comments or give a point that you learned from one of the other people today. So you can kind of take that either direction you want to go. Amber, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I really, I think first I appreciated Ben's description for the CARES Act. I know there's been, at least I've been hearing a lot of confusion around that around the country with regards to the math. And so I think making sure that, everybody kind of understands they can use local dollars or they can use state dollars to kind of achieve that is really important. And then I think the other piece I would just say on it is, while the CARES Act was good in the sense that it has provided some support, based on our conversations with election officials across the country and local jurisdictions at the state level, it's just not enough. And so I just appreciated Ben's, description of what's been done so far, and then hoping that Congress recognizes that, a lot of these local jurisdictions are particularly going to be in trouble come the fall, just from a budgetary perspective, given how many cuts are happening right now. And so I think that we have to make sure that local election officials have what they need to respond to these increases in terms of what voters are asking for. Because, as I said in my presentation, it's not up to policymakers, it's not up to political parties, it's not up to politicians to decide what voters are going to choose. Voters are choosing a method of voting right now on their own, and we have to be ready to respond to that volume.
Excellent. And Mark, next to you.
Sure. I mean, the policymakers, the legislative officials, the members, and the boards of elections need to recognize that they do need to be aggressive at addressing these issues. Because if they don't address them, they'll get a chance to address them in litigation. There's already a vast sea of litigation on these issues across the country. Mm-hmm. The worst possible place, frankly, to create election procedures and policies is in a federal courtroom or a state courtroom. The best way to do it is through the legislative process, or through a legislative process in conjunction with the people who actually run elections. So you need, as I'm a lawyer, so I should be wildly in favor of litigation, but in this area I'm wildly against litigation, because federal courts are not the sophisticated place on actually conducting elections. So even though you want to drag your feet, you really don't have any choice. You need to be proactive, or some federal judge or state judge is going to be proactive against you.
Good point. Thank you. And Chairman.
So certainly I thought, both Amber and Mark's made a lot of great points, and the way I'll sort of combine them and come back to the funding piece is, one of the things that we think a lot about is certainly this funding, and again, the CARES Act is the part that we've got. But obviously, there's always this conversation around state and local are responsible for running elections in this country and are primarily responsible for funding elections in this area, or funding elections. And I think one of the pieces that we've recognized, and certainly a number of congressional inquiries we've got, is that what state and local election officials are facing right now is not the election that they planned for or budgeted for originally. And certainly we see where there are often benefits fiscally. Vote by mail, when it's fully implemented, can be cheaper. We know that. But that's not what we're necessarily looking for or looking at in most of the country this year. I think we're going to see election officials having more mail ballots than they've ever had before, with the exception of the full vote-by-mail states. And then you're also going to be running polling places, but you're going to be operating a polling place that needs PPE, that is going to have challenges getting poll workers. You're going to be needing to move sites, certainly from senior centers we've heard, but also identifying new polling place locations that can accommodate the social distancing that we need, whether that's between polling stations or check-in stations, or even allowing for voters to be in a line, with the current CDC recommendation of 6 feet apart. And so there are all these additional costs that we're hearing about at the EAC, but certainly, and recognize that it's important for the federal government to play a role there, particularly with what's happening to state and local budgets right now. But I do think it's important to the degree that people are able to help quantify that. That is a very important piece of sort of the ongoing conversation. So I would like to emphasize that.
Excellent. So now I'm going to take some questions that came in through the chat box. And the first one is from Tim Butler. He says, and this is probably for you, Amber, but I'm not 100% certain. Any thoughts on managing voter rolls at a time when potentially so many people have changed where they reside under the pandemic, especially thinking of college students who've been forced to move home due to campus closings, yet they may still be registered where they lived at school? What can you tell us about how voter registration can help?
Sure. Well, a couple of things on that. I mean, first off, the most sophisticated systems that are the most secure are systems that utilize all the government platforms, whether that be motor vehicle or other platforms, to make sure addresses are up to date, that the election officials have the most current information. AVR has been widely supported by both Republicans and Democrats for that reason around the country, and have cleaned up a lot of voter files. And if you look at the states that mail a ballot to every elector, they actually have the cleanest voter files in the country because they do this sort of regular mailing out. And it's critically important for us to know where to send a ballot to. So they have, like Colorado, for instance, has a system where they automatically update addresses off of the National Change of Address database, and those change of address forms that voters fill out at the post office. And that's one of our key recommendations to a lot of states that currently don't do a very good list maintenance, like the state of Texas, like others that don't have these sort of sophisticated steps to make sure their voter registration and address lists stay current. The second piece, so I think NCOA and that's National Change of Address, is a great way to do that. I think the other piece that I would just say, and this is another recommendation we've been making lately, is that now that there's been motor vehicle offices closed for a few months in most states, that's the top method of voter registration that happens in our country, through the motor vehicle office. Across the board in every single state, that is the highest use method in terms of voter registration. And so given there's been those closures, there's going to be a backlog, and students have moved back home, campuses have been closed, all those aspects. And we're likely not going to see the same voter registration drive activity that normally happens during the summer months because a lot of events are being canceled. There's going to be these sort of differences. So one thing that we've suggested is we think that given this large backlog that's being created, National Voter Registration Day, which is normally the way late September, it's normally the fourth Tuesday in September, should be moved up to the first Tuesday in September, meaning September 1st, to try to catch up and accommodate this influx, if you will, that's likely going to happen in the fall once kids are back in school potentially, once more people kind of move and maybe get back to what their some normalcy. And we're very concerned that that date is way too late, because when you have an increase in vote by mail, you're cutting those files to send to your vendors earlier in September than late September. So what we don't want to see happen is there to be this huge influx of voter registration that will ultimately crush election officials if it's done so late like it normally is in the cycle.
Great. I appreciate that. And Mark, we have a question with your name literally on it. It comes from Sean Sukol. He says, I'd like to hear Mark expound a bit on the civic value of in-person voting on a single election day. That's a topic we haven't heard much of yet during these webinars.
Sure. We do have few shared political experiences and few shared civic experiences. And election day is one of them, or has traditionally been one of them. Going to the local elementary school and getting the brownies, and then passing a array of your neighbors who are attempting to give you a piece of paper telling you should vote X or Y or vote for the school board, or the bond issue, is a very important degree, maybe the only way that people are civically involved. And so I think that's extremely important for people to have that level of engagement. Our Constitution in our country was based upon the notion that we were going to have some sort of, to use the term that they would have used at that time, civic virtue. People actively involved, and it does seem to me, I absolutely understand that there are people who cannot attend in person. And I absolutely understand that in this particular circumstances, that may be a very large number, or maybe virtually everyone. But that doesn't in any way mean that we should look at this and dismiss its importance going forward. This sort of shared experience is, I think, very important. I think voting should be a thoughtful, considered experience. I think politics on Election Day, campaigns are truncated. If we're doing mail voting, let's be candid, that then moves the campaign periods up, and many late developing campaign issues are irrelevant because so much of the electorate has voted earlier. So it seems to me that there are important issues being discussed in the last week of the campaign. If you have 100% mail voting, those issues are interesting but irrelevant to the actual election process, who wins and who loses.
Interesting. I know that we've enjoyed doing the voting on our dining room table with our kids. Now they're all grown up and gone, but that was our family activity, not our civic activity. A question for you, Chairman Hovland, comes from Kim Brace. He says the one problem with vote by mail is that there is no or very limited capability for voters to correct their ballot if they have voted for too many candidates, for example. I think you would know this as a residual vote rate. Will counties send better instructions and reminders on how to properly mark ballots?
That is a great plug for one of our Zoom call webinars that actually Amber was on as well. One of the issues that we've consistently heard about is the need for voter education, particularly as jurisdictions ramp up increase in mail and absentee ballots if they haven't had them in the past. And so, again, we did a Zoom call specifically on this issue with Amber, with Brian Corley, who's a election official in Florida, and then with Whitney Quisenberry with the Center for Civic Design, who all have had experiences communicating with voters and refining that. And certainly, something like the ballot trace technology that Amber implemented in Denver, I think plays a big role in communicating with voters about the status of their ballot. But as far as the instructions, I think that is a big piece of how you're able to do this right, is to recognize that this may be a new process for a lot of voters. And so focusing on clear and clean communications and instructions to walk them step by step through the process.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to wrap up a couple of the questions here real quickly. Norman Lee asked about the costs and is there good data on it? I think I can say that it's very difficult to get that data, that people at the Auburn University are working on that. I can send you an email later on and connect you on that. Kim also asked about whether ballots go to active and inactive voters. I think the answer is that they go to active voters. Amber, when I turn to you, you can correct me if I'm wrong about that. And Secretary Hargett pointed out that absentee status of voters with physical disabilities, and there are a number of the states that do ask for an excuse for voting that have that, and Tennessee is amongst those. Okay, I got 2 questions for each of you, and you can choose either one to respond to. One of those is, would you like to talk about the role of the executive branch and the role of the legislature in setting election policy? Obviously, during an emergency, it looks like governors and sometimes secretaries of state are the ones who hold the power to change things by executive order, and yet legislatures are usually where policy on topics like this comes. And I'm wondering if there's any shift in that. So that's your first option. And the other, is there one takeaway that you'd like to leave with folks? And again, I think I'll do Amber, then Mark, and then Ben.
Well, first, I think what I'll do is I'll sort of combine them, Wendy,
Great.
if that's okay. So,
Yeah.
So first and foremost, I think what this pandemic has exposed is the tremendous vulnerabilities that exist in the reliance, the kind of sole reliance in some states on in-person voting on one day. There's not only issues with the pandemic and crowds and all that, but there's a lot of security and risks and issues with that. And we also know that it doesn't work for people that maybe work longer than 12 hours on Election Day, which are doctors and nurses and all of those sorts of things. So the overall reliance, the way that we've operated, is problematic. And we know that in addition to that, the sort of structure of governance, if you will, with how the laws are administered, there's frankly been very little flexibility afforded to governors or secretaries of state in these emergency situations. So I think the other part of the conversation going forward is going to have to be, how do we address the emergency that's before us this year? And then what does this look like going forward? Do the appropriate people have the appropriate authority to act in emergency situations? And are there good procedures for that going forward? There's been a lot of unknowns this year. There's been a lot of legal action, and I agree with Mark that I don't think figuring these things out at the last minute in a court of law is always the best solution for voters and election administrators. And so I think we're going to really have to think thoughtfully about what that structure looks like, given what we've dealt with this year. And then finally, what I would say is, Mark brought up voting at schools. Well, one thing that we're seeing around the country, and I'm talking to election officials all the time, nursing homes, assisted living locations, and schools are dropping out in terms of being polling locations, and that's going to continue in the fall. The schools are trying to figure out how to open in a safe way for students to come back. They are not going to be open to the general public coming in when we're also trying to deal with a pandemic, and that's what's been happening. Nursing homes will likely never be polling places again, given this issue that's come up. And so I think we really have to think very thoughtfully about these structures that are in place and how we deal with them in an emergency situation like what we've had.
Thank you, Amber. And Mark, either something on the executive branch and the legislatures, sure, or a final comment.
Yeah, I would strongly urge the legislature to be the principal point for decision-making on this. Now, what does that mean? It means you pass a statute setting forth, okay, if there's a hurricane or whether, in other words, giving certain emergency powers in elections to the Secretary of State or the governor or other chief election officials in certain circumstances that the legislature would, to a significant degree, set forth. So that's really ad hoc processes present problems, so if you can address them up front through legislation, that's the way to do it. I mean, clearly a single executive making decisions like this always raise political questions and concerns. If it's a legal structure rather than an ad hoc decision-making process, it's much better. Certainly, there are going to be problems within, voting in person because of limitations of polling places and, frankly, limitations of polling place workers. I used to joke about this when I was much younger. I don't joke this way anymore about all the election workers being Q-tips because they all had white hair. Of course, now that I have white hair, that joke isn't quite as funny as it was then. But it's true. I mean, our polling place workers across the country are older who clearly, apparently, from the data that I see so far, seem to have reasons to be more concerned, and we're going to have trouble recording poll workers. So these are all concerns. I'm not telling many election officials things that they don't already know now, but these are all concerns that need to be addressed. I guess my final word is this is a unique circumstance. I mean, the last pandemic we had was in 1918, 1919. So changes you make now in dealing with these type of unusual situations, I would not suggest this is the best circumstance in which to go to a totally different way of voting outside these particular circumstances.
Great. One of the things that NCSL hopes to do in the next few months is to look at what are the powers between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and what are the laws that govern that in regard to elections specifically. And we've got some of that already in place and more to come. And Chairman Hovland, you have the final word here.
Great, thank you. And I will sort of take out of both a little bit here. I think less than I will focus on or comment on sort of where the appropriate branch is. I'd say I think the important piece is, as my colleagues have said on the call already, one is having a structure in place to make those determinations, and I think make those determinations as quick as possible. I think we've learned sort of above and beyond everything else that time is of the essence here, and having the ability to know what is going to be the process as soon as possible, both for administrators to put those steps in place, but also for the voter education component. A few months ago, most of what we were talking about in elections had to do with cybersecurity, and those issues haven't gone away. And so I would say, similarly, this environment now creates opportunities that are ripe for misinformation and disinformation. And so the ability to have that definitive information as soon as possible, and then be able to promote trusted sources like state and local election officials as the source for that information is crucial. When we see primary days changing, when we see different requirements changing in how elections are going to be administered, it's important for Americans to be getting that information, but getting it from a trusted source. And so having those decisions made as quickly as possible and not being drug out in court fights, I think, is an important component to that.
I am hearing a shared value here to stay out of court if you can. With that, we've come to the end of our hour. We've run over. We appreciate that everybody has hung in here with us. Do ask that you stay on the line and do a quick survey of topics you'd like to hear before. But let's right now give a round of applause, whatever that might look like in your kitchen or bedroom, for Amber, Mark, and Chairman Hovland. It's been a wonderful hour. Please stay in touch. And with that, we're going to call it a wrap.
Thank you.